Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second Live Green webinar in our series of Live Green webinars. Today we're going to be focusing on touring. My name is Greg Palmley. I'm the CEO of Live, the Managing Director of the International Live Music Conference. Just to really sort of mention quickly that today's webinar, as all of the webinars, is sort of part information sharing about sort of environmental sustainability measures that can be put in place fairly quickly, and also part sort of consultation really around the voluntary declaration and vision that the Live Green team have been working on, which is sort of an ongoing process and a live document. So please do, as we go through today, feel free to put comments into the chat or questions. We'll try and make the session as interactive as possible. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's webinar hosts. So welcome to Jamal Chalabi from the Touring Production Group, Carol Scott from SEPA and Tate, Claire O'Neill from A Greener Festival, and Chiara Badiali from Julie's Bicycle. Okay, I'm going to remove myself as well as everyone apart from Chiara, and then we'll get going.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for tuning in for the second of these Live Green webinars. So my name is Chiara. I work at a charity called Julie's Bicycle. We were founded nearly 15 years ago from within the UK music industry to support the industry to take action on climate change and other environmental challenges. We still do that and also work with the wider performing and visual arts and more through consultancy, certification, research, training, and kind of helping get new networks and programs off the ground wherever we can. So thanks so much to Greg and Live for asking us to kind of host these workshops. Thanks to everyone for tuning in what continues to be a really difficult time. And many, many thanks to Carol, Jamal, and Claire, who are here with us and will share some of their brilliant work and insights later on. As Greg said, please do feel free to use the comments function to ask questions throughout. We want these to be as useful to you as possible. So already kicking off, if you want to introduce yourself, for example, where you're tuning in from, what you do, that would be great. So we have a bit of an idea of who we're with. So today's spotlight is on touring. You can also watch back last week's session on offices. Later this week, we're going to look at what the Live Green vision might mean for festivals. And then next week, we look at venues and also artists and management. So if you're tuning in for the second time, there might be some overlap before we dig into the specifics. So please do bear with us, or again, use your time in the chat instead. So Greg, if we could go to slides, that would be great. So kicking off, this is the Live Beyond Zero vision, which is a work in progress at the moment. This is not a rehearsal. We commit to regenerative future, taking the lead on climate action and collaborating towards a sustainable society. We acknowledge responsibility for individual and collective actions to make ongoing absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and reach net zero by 2030. We'll work together with our stakeholders to inspire positive change in areas outside our direct control. So we'll come back to this in a little bit. The reason we've ended up here is really that we're burning through millions of years of energy that has been stored up by plants. And we're doing that in the space of about 100 years. It's now hotter than it's been in the entire history of civilization. If you imagine the atmosphere as a bathtub with all the taps running, we're putting more greenhouse gases in there than natural sinks and processes can remove. So the bathtub's filling up and it's getting warmer. And the climate is not going to stop changing until we stop putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. What matters isn't just how much we're putting in any given year, but actually how much we've put in total over time. So this is kind of a one-way process. Where we are now already with the droughts and the heat waves and the weird weather is kind of here to stay. We're not going back, but what we do get to decide is how much worse this gets and where we go from here. So the decisions that we're making now are really going to set the course of the next 1,000 years on this planet. And what we have to achieve is we have to roughly halve our global emissions every decade from now on and get to net zero by 2050. That means that us who are here today, alive and working over the next 30 years, more or less have been landed with this task of solving climate change. We can do that by doing two things. We, especially those of us living in Europe, North America, and other countries that have contributed a lot to historical emissions and still have very large per person carbon footprints, have to cut our impacts. And we have to push for bigger picture changes in policies, laws, investments, and so on. So net zero comes from this knowledge that the climate won't stop changing until we stop filling up the bathtub. So we have to get to a point where the sources of greenhouse gas emissions have to be equal to or less than the sinks. In practice, what that actually means is reducing emissions, getting to nearly zero, and then netting out the remaining emissions by removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. But the net here is not doing the heavy lifting. The reductions are doing the heavy lifting. We can't net ourselves out of the current levels of emissions. We don't have the land or technology to get that level of greenhouse gas emissions back out of the atmosphere. Relying on the idea of removals without doing the reductions would be kind of like using a cup or a thimble to try to get water out of the bathtub while a fire hose was still pumping water in. So the only thing we're kind of netting out by 2050 is usually air travel and some agricultural emissions. Everything else we have brought to zero carbon. In terms of where the sources of greenhouse gas emissions come from, the main one really is carbon dioxide. It's very long-lived in our atmosphere. It's most of the emissions by volume, and that mainly comes from burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil or gas for energy that we use for electricity, for heating and transport. A second important greenhouse gas is methane, which is stronger than carbon dioxide, meaning it causes more warming, but it's fairly short-lived in the atmosphere. And that mainly comes from agriculture, so livestock and cow burps, and also things like landfill, where organic matter is decomposing and releasing methane into the air. I won't dwell on this for too long, but these are some of the scenarios that are used by the Committee on Climate Change to inform UK policy. That doesn't mean this is exactly what's going to happen, but it means it's one way of trying to achieve the net zero aims that the UK has. You can think of this as kind of the minimum we have to do over the next 30 years. Many people do say we have to be more ambitious than this. So the first area is changing the way that electricity is made, so it's zero carbon, and actually doubling the amount of electricity we make so that we can power all of the stuff that we want to shift over to being powered by electricity. For tours, for example, that could mean giving preference to venues that are already powered by renewable energy. In our buildings, which is where most of the electricity in the UK is used today, one of the things we have to do is radically improve energy efficiency, and that's relevant to touring in terms of the kind of audiovisual and lighting technology that you specify for tour designs. For road and surface transport, to get to net zero in the UK means that by 2050, there shouldn't be anything that is powered by a petrol or diesel engine on our roads anymore. So we have 30 years to completely change how we get around on our roads. This is the biggest area of emissions in the UK today, and it's also been really stubbornly flat for years now. We haven't managed to reduce it. So for trucks, buses, and heavy goods vehicles that get used in touring, the most important thing over the next 5 years or so is efficiency, reducing how many trucks or vehicles you're taking on the road, specifying the most efficient engines like Euro 6, making sure drivers are trained to drive in fuel-efficient ways. Some trucks can also be retrofitted to be more efficient, and that can lead to about 20% savings in fuel use. As a whole industry, we also have to stay on top of the big shifts that are coming. So heavy goods vehicles are either going to have to be powered by electricity through batteries and maybe some overhead lines. Some might also be hydrogen powered, but electricity is kind of winning this technology fight. So that means being ready for some big investment cycles for touring technology in the next 10 years. It also means working with venues to make sure that the venues are ready for those investments, things like charging points, back of house. And that's kind of at the level of large tours. The other way to think about it as well is how we shift more stuff, people and transport away from roads onto things like trains. So we both reduce car usage and the miles driven overall. One thing to note is that biofuels like HVO are generally seen in these big scenarios as a bridge fuel. They're not a long-term solution past the next 5 to 10 years because there's a limited supply of sustainable biofuel in the world. And we kind of need it for other things that are even harder to shift away from fuel, basically. In terms of road transport, we also have to reduce the number of miles driven on roads in general by getting people to travel less or shifting to other ways of getting around. That means also paying attention to how people are getting to gigs and shows and incentivizing them to travel by public transport, cycling, or walking. In the same way that we have to get rid of our diesel and petrol vehicles on our roads, we also have to phase out diesel generators. And the way we're going to hopefully get there is by, among other things, being more efficient, specifying less power, which means that it makes it easier to shift those generators that we're currently using to other technologies, like mains grid connections, like battery power models. And again, there may or may not be some space for hydrogen in this space. We also have to shift to a more circular economy. In the plainest terms, that means using stuff for longer, reusing materials, and shifting from higher carbon materials to lower carbon materials. For touring, again, that relates very much to how we design the shows that we take on the road. For agriculture and land use, the main aim is to free up agricultural land so that we can give it back to nature, use it for other things like tree planting. And a big part of that is reducing how much meat and dairy we eat in the UK. So again, Chameleon climate change scenarios look at a 20 to 40% reduction by 2050. That's sort of in the middle. We could go more ambitious, which allows us to free up more land as well. So that means, especially in an industry like live music, we have a real opportunity to influence change through the kinds of food concessions that we have at venues and festivals. And then there's air travel, which of course is kind of our Achilles heel as an industry. It's about 7% of the UK's emissions today, although that doesn't include the non-carbon dioxide impacts from flying at height in the atmosphere. We don't have the technology to make flying zero carbon on the kinds of timelines that we need. So pretty much every plan means that aviation demand can't grow from where we are now. So we can't fly more than we do now. If anything, we have to reduce the number of flights. And in the UK, half of adults in a given year already don't fly at all. So 15% of people take 70% of flights. And that means the music industry and us, we are among them. So thinking about where and when and why we travel by air is going to get very important. We talk a lot about this idea of a carbon footprint, which is the measure of the climate change impact of a business or an activity or a product or a venue or an event. It's basically trying to put the climate impact of different activities into a single number, and also the different greenhouse gases, expressing them as a single number, a carbon dioxide equivalent. It sort of compares how much different greenhouse gases warm things as a single number. And you get there by using things like the kilowatt hours of electricity you use or how much waste you're sending to landfill. And there are things called carbon conversion factors that give you then a carbon footprint. Some things, like burning a litre of diesel, have more or less the same carbon footprint wherever you are in the world, but not everything does. So, for example, a venue using the same amount of electricity has a different carbon footprint depending on how that electricity is generated. And also, certain things get harder and harder to measure because there are more variables in there. So if you ask what the carbon footprint of a tomato is, that depends a bit on how the land that it's grown on is managed, how the farm machinery is powered, whether it's been grown in a greenhouse that uses energy, and so on and so forth. So to try and keep some consistency in how businesses report their carbon footprint, there's an internationally accepted framework for greenhouse gas accounting called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that basically tries to put the responsibility for emissions as close to the source of where fossil fuels are being burnt, because we know what the carbon impact of burning fossil fuels is, and it's the main source of our emissions. So in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Scope 1 are emissions from owned or operated assets, So the gas you burn in your gas boilers and your company-owned, the fuel you burn in your company-owned vehicles or in your generators. Scope 2 is emissions from the energy you buy that's generated elsewhere. So mainly that's going to be electricity. If you're a venue that's connected to a district heat network, it might also be that. But it's basically electricity for most of us. And scope 3 is the emissions from everything else. So that could be business travel, the goods and services you buy, transportation and distribution that you're commissioning off someone else, things like audience travel. So sometimes that gets called the value chain. Again, it's a sort of a technical word that comes out of this framework. It's not a perfect framework for everything we do in the music industry, but it is kind of the internationally accepted one for greenhouse gas reporting for businesses. So we try and make it work. And so sometimes you can use the greenhouse gas protocol to think of your impacts, but another good way and approach is also to think about what's within your sphere and levers of control. So the things that you control directly. And for a tour, that might be things like how the tour is routed, how it's designed, and therefore how much stuff you take on the road, how you choose to travel. The next level is what you influence. So again, for a tour, that might be things like how are audiences traveling to shows? How is the venue that you are playing at managing its own impacts? And then there are the things that you don't directly influence, but that impact you and the environmental impacts that you have. And that might be places where you might want to campaign for bigger picture change. So things like investment into public transport infrastructure, or even campaigning around how train travel is priced in this country. So coming back to the Live UK vision, around this idea, we commit to regenerative future, so giving back more than we take, taking the lead on climate action and working together towards a sustainable society, acknowledging responsibility for individual and collective actions to make ongoing absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, so focusing on scope 1, scope 2, and business travel, and reaching net zero by 2030. And working together with our stakeholders to inspire positive change in areas outside our direct control. So in practice, that means for the next 10 years, we focus on reducing emissions, working with others to reduce theirs, and asking for change. Committing from 2030 that we're going to match remaining emissions with an equivalent amount of greenhouse gas removals. But again, the removals come after the reductions. So this is about how we run live music businesses, events, venues, and tours, how we role model those green investments, technologies, actions, and behaviors, how we support audiences, artists, and others we're working with, visiting us to do the right thing, and how we use the platforms that we have to call for and support change. The specifics of the Live Green Declaration are: we will work towards the following: work with Live Green to reduce our operational and business travel greenhouse gas emissions, set reduction targets in line with the Live Green vision, measure and report progress annually, develop a net zero roadmap and action plan, taking responsibility for actions in energy, waste procurement, transport, food, and governance, understand and define emissions within our value chain, follow best practice to effect change in areas outside of our direct control, and collaborate with suppliers and clients towards the Live Beyond Zero vision, ensuring our people undertake climate literacy education and have an ongoing commitment to knowledge sharing within the live music sector and beyond, talk to our stakeholders honestly about the impacts of our business on the environment and efforts we're making towards a regenerative future. So for tour businesses, trying to pull that apart. Touring in some ways is kind of the most complex area to try and apply this to because there are so many different moving parts. So I think partly we can think of businesses that are involved in touring. So Carol will talk a little bit in a minute about what Tate Towers are doing. And so what that means, what measuring and publicly reporting scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and emissions from business travel means. Say if you were a set design and build company, I'd also encourage you to watch back the previous Live Green webinar on offices, which digs a little bit more into the sort of general actions for businesses and what it means. But for a tour, measuring and publicly reporting scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and emissions from business travel means keeping track of tour travel and transport, so liters of fuel or mileage and type of vehicle if you can't get the liters of fuel, although you should be able to. Flights, distance, or the number of long haul versus short haul flights, and class of flights, the number of hotel nights, any other car mileage, the distance of train travel. Again, if you work with a travel agent, they should be able to support that collection of information, but otherwise somewhere in your tour and production management records, all of that info should be there. Any liters of fuel that are used in supplementary generator power for really big shows. And it may or may not include, if you can get the information, but it is at the moment quite tricky to get that, the electricity use at the venue, so for the show power. Again, setting a reduction target for tours is slightly trickier, because we can think of it as, in 10 years' time, we want the average tour of a certain size to have half of the carbon footprint that it has now. But because tours are very different to begin with, it's quite difficult to set a specific baseline. So the focus for every tour we work on is to start measuring, doing that during the planning phase already, and starting to consider environmental impact as part of planning alongside financial and creative considerations. So when making choices about routing, how many vehicles we're taking on the road, and so on and so forth, and taking action to reduce impacts. So that leads nicely into developing and following a roadmap and action plan to achieve reductions. Again, looking at impacts in different areas, helping provide training to everyone we work with. So either organizing training for staff or crew, or giving permission to and paying crew to attend climate literacy training workshops and be part of information exchange networks. Putting climate on the agenda in meetings with crew, staff, partners, audiences, suppliers, and being part of Live Green, so contributing to that information and knowledge sharing. Looking at sort of the example carbon footprints of different kinds of tour, where our hotspots are really depends on the territory and the scale of tours. So up at the top, you can see 2 club tours, similar number of shows. In a UK club tour, the entirety of the carbon footprint is the personnel ground transport. Effectively, this is a tour in a van where everyone's sleeping in a van. Whereas in the Australia club tour, the majority of the carbon footprint of that tour is now from the flights that have been taken to get to Australia. Another example on there is a North America theatre tour. You've got the air travel making up about 1/3 of the impact, freight making up another 1/3, and then the sort of ground transport is in your trucking in America and hotels together making up the last 1/3. On this example of a European arena tour, again, just over half there is the air travel, people getting around. Freight is about 1/3. Ground transport in this one is much, much less. So there's clearly been more flights to get between venues. And on this last example of a UK stadium tour, suddenly actually you can see how much the use of on-site generators can impact as well, that overall carbon footprint picture. So all these carbon footprints just look at how the crew and the staff of the tour is getting around, and where extra generators have been brought in to power that. So they don't include the venue or festival side impacts or people traveling to a show. So within the work that we've done, it varies from 70 kilos of carbon emissions per show on a UK club tour to over 40 tons per show for an international arena tour, which gives you a bit of an idea of just the differences in scale that we're working to. How you travel makes a big difference in terms of the carbon emissions per passenger per kilometre. You can compare there a long haul business class flight to the impact of, say, taking a coach. But also the overall distance makes a difference. One of the reasons flights are so high carbon is because of how far we travel in them, and also how many people are traveling. So this is looking kind of at a smaller scale of touring a bit, but the difference for doing 2,000 miles in a 4-piece band, if you did it in a bus, it's nearly 3 tons. If you did it in 4 diesel cars, though, it's still over 2 tons. So suddenly you start gaining efficiencies, especially if people start sleeping on the bus as well, and you're not also counting the impact of hotels. So it is interesting that, you know, for train passengers, if you just look at the carbon footprint of that, is actually quite similar to the carbon footprint of a single diesel car if you put all 4 people into the car. But it's also worth remembering there that the train would run anyway, whereas with a van or a car or a bus, it's an additional vehicle that you're putting on the road that is in your control. So in terms of tour action plans, I won't spend too long on this because I think Jamal and the production group have been doing some absolutely amazing work, sort of pulling together what this looks like. But starting off by making environmental impact a key consideration of design and planning from the start that sits alongside financial and artistic considerations. So making sure everyone is on board and you've made it a priority. Giving someone the responsibility for overseeing that. That could be a production manager, it could be an external sustainability coordinator, someone in the office, but crucially making sure, again, they have permission to do it and they're resourced to do this, especially if they're a freelancer. Putting in place some kind of statement of intent that you can share with partners around what you're trying to achieve. On the design and planning side, routing to minimize air travel, considering environmental questions when selecting venues already, so right from the start. Working with suppliers and partners who share your ambitions and vision, who have their own environmental plans and strategies. Designing to minimize the number of vehicles you're taking with you, designing to reduce power demand, and designing sets and things with end of life in mind. So what happens to all this stuff that you're building at the end of the tour? Measuring and pricing your emissions. So you can start scoping emissions during tour planning, especially when you're looking at big production choices. You can use the Juice Bicycle Creative Green Tools for Tours, which are free to start doing that, or contact a consultancy for additional support around this. Set a price per ton of emissions that will help you start integrating, again, that financial impact, the environmental impact of your tour, but start building it in really your tour accounting systems. And you can use that price per ton of emissions through offsetting, but you can also invest in climate projects or make sort of equivalent donations to climate justice causes. Again, the focus over the next 10 years is really how are we going to reduce emissions? Asking for change, so asking venues, festivals and others to take action too, and focusing on the big asks, especially for larger tours, really bringing these up at the negotiation and booking stage. So is the venue powered by renewable energy? Is it accessible by public transport? And what share of audience actually tend to arrive by public transport? Can the venue share their environmental policy and action plan? And can they provide a key contact point for any sustainability questions further down the line? On energy, reducing energy use, energy efficiency in terms of lighting and equipment. For larger shows, being better about power monitoring to get an accurate spec of power needs, so you can share that with venues and festivals. On transport, I think trying to minimize air travel trips, especially looking at, you know, trips that happen around the tour planning that are sort of associated with the tour, but not really integral to it necessarily. I think at the moment we do a lot of that. And it's kind of the low-hanging fruit in terms of things we might address. Using sea freight over air freight, even looking at rail freight where possible. There are some touring musicians that have tried partnerships with people like DHL to take advantage of existing kind of logistics infrastructure in a different way. Where possible, again, acknowledging this isn't always possible, but where it is, flying economy, business class is nearly 3 times and first class nearly 4 times the impact because you can get fewer seats on the plane. Sizing vehicles right and choosing the right ones. Working with promoters to get fans to travel differently. That can be as simple as making sure public transport information is shared at point of sale, or it can be much more involved, especially for bigger shows, organizing shuttle buses, putting in place incentives for car sharing and so on and so forth. Going meat and fish free for your rider and reducing food waste, and also working with the venues on your tour to make sure they have a minimum vegan or vegetarian offering, or potentially even working on getting a whole vegan and vegetarian offering. And other things like considering sustainability when ordering merchandise, so print-on-demand systems that can reduce overstock, upcycling overstock like the 1975 have done by screen printing over old stock, and making sure you specify minimum social and environmental standards, things like organic cotton, fair trade cotton, certifications that look at workers' rights. So in terms of a hierarchy, measure to understand, avoid emissions by doing things differently. So some of this might also mean looking at our whole business model around certain tours very differently, and looking to the future around what does this really look like in 10 years' time? What is this asking of us to do? Reducing emissions by increasing efficiency, replacing high carbon energy sources with lower carbon energy sources, like shifting to renewable energy, and putting a cost on emissions that can't be eliminated, but only if you're confident that you're also managing and reducing your carbon footprint in other ways. Again, the Julie's Bicycle Creative Green tools are a free tool that you can start to use to measure some of your impacts. And we've also got lots of free guides and resources, like our moving arts study on touring, putting a price on carbon, green riders to look at. And sort of everything that we do, we want to shift from this idea of just how do we reduce our environmental impact to actually how do we bring our creativity to fighting climate change, social justice, livable cities and places, restoring nature. So how do we fulfill that regenerative part of the vision? How do we give back more than we take? There's lots of help and community that is out there from what we can do as Julie's Bicycle, but also many of the people who are on the call, who you will hear from in a second. And again, there's lots and lots of work that's being done in here in this space. So for example, we're just working with Live Nation on shaping an approach to their touring at the moment. And with that, I will hand over to Carol first from Tate Towers, who will talk a little bit about what they have been doing to address their impacts and support others to do the same. Thank you, Carol.
Hi, thanks everyone, and thank you, Chiara, for that. It was amazing. So at Tate, we have spent the last few months collating our carbon emissions on Scope 1 and Scope 2, as Chiara spoke to earlier on, and part of Scope 3. So on Scope 3, we started reporting on our waste streams here in the UK, and we intend to add to that next year our business travel, because we're working with our travel agent so that they can produce reports for us and split out the reporting by location as well as by projects. So we'll be able to tell whether or not we've been traveling on project-related flights or whether they're overhead related. And also what we've done is we've taken all of the information that we've collated on Scope 1, 2 and 3, and we've conducted some energy audits on the 4 locations that we have over here in the UK with a view to writing a carbon reduction strategy. And we're very much working on the philosophy that what we manage and what we measure, we will manage, and that we will have a long-term game of being able to have a reduction strategy in place that we will be able to share with our employees so that we all know what we're buying into. It hasn't been that difficult a process, so if it's new to you, you can bring in external parties to come in and help you report on your carbon emissions. It's not expensive. It's really just collecting the data and managing it and getting everybody involved in the process. And one of the things that we've also decided to do is that we have decided that we will incorporate sustainability into the DNA of our organization. And we are in the process of creating green champions throughout our organization so that we have champions that work on sustainability throughout our entire organization so that we can drive change. And everything that we're doing on the reporting for scopes 1, 2 and 3 that we've currently been doing here in the UK, we're now reporting with our annual accounts, and we are repeating the process in all our locations globally so that we can have our global carbon footprint. And one of the things that we've done while we've been in the hiatus over COVID is we've taken the time to rationalise and standardise our assets so that we can use them more productively, so that we're using less virgin materials. And one of the things that we really are reaching out to our stakeholders in the ecosystem of concert touring is to start asking for more time so that we can have more time working with the creative teams very much earlier on in the process, so that we can be part of that creative process and work more collaboratively with the designers, so that when we can use more existing assets, we can say to the designers, well, we don't have a 3-meter revolve, but we have a 2.5-meter revolve. Can we redesign the set so that we can incorporate that rather than building from scratch? And the other thing that we'd really like to do is we'd really like to start working with the designers at the very beginning of the process to identify what we're going to do with the products that we make at the end. Are they going to become part of rental assets? Are they going to be something that can be donated or given to schools or colleges or the local community at the end of the project? Can we design in a way that bespoke pieces can be taken apart at the end of the tour so that they can go back to their nutrient elements, and those pieces of wood and aluminum, etc., can be used on other projects? Or can we even take it a stage further and say, can we do something with the decking and the staging so that we're perhaps using it later on in life so that it gets made into furniture and sold, or the drapes are made into bags and rucksack and sold, so that the band either can have another way of generating revenue, or perhaps very graciously give that additional revenue stream to a charity of their choice. So we really are asking the community in rock and roll to start the process earlier on about thinking about the tour, about the way it's routed, or the way it's going to have to be transported, because that has a huge impact on the design of the set, and to allow us to be involved much earlier on in the process so that we can make better choices. The shorter the lead time becomes for us means that there is a huge impact, because it then starts to dictate what materials we can use, because we can't actually go out and be sourcing and investigating new, more sustainable materials if we have a deadline that we have to fix. We do need to meet. We do have to have time to do that research. It also means that we're often forced into situations where we are very much limited in our choices. For example, we have to perhaps fly drives in from China or elsewhere because the thing that we actually really want isn't available locally. So the shorter the lead time, the more expedited the costs are, and the worse it is for the guys on the shop floor. And one thing that we really have to consider in sustainability is the sustainability of our people. We need to make sure that our people are able to have a really good work-life balance, and that they're well rested. And shortened lead times often means to horrific amounts of overtime, which leads to attrition in our industry, because we lose people just because they don't want to be working 24/7. So I very much welcome your thoughts in the comments about anything that I've spoken to, whether it's how to collect your data for scope 1, 2 and 3, and if you want any help and advice on how to do that yourself, I'm happy to explore that with you, and equally happy to explore your thoughts on how to create a better working environment for us all. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Carol, for your insights there. And up next, we have Jamal and Claire, who will talk a little bit about the work they've been doing with the Tour Production Group and at Greener Festival.
Thank you, Chiara. And are you able to share the slides again, please?
Greg, can you share the slides again, please? Thank you.
The levers in the background. So I'm Claire O'Neill from AGF, otherwise known as a Greener Festival. And we've been working with the international events music industry for 15 years on sustainability. We do certification for festivals, but also arenas, tours, venues, and vendors. And since the pandemic, we've also been working alongside the TPG very closely on all of their sustainability work, which has been fantastic. And we organise the Green Events and Innovations Conference with ILMC. So I may have seen many of you there. What I wanted to go through today is just a few examples of actual CO2 analysis audits that we've done for some very specific tour examples with the TPG, with members of the TPG. Starting with this large European stadium tour. And it might be surprising to see there that actually the accommodation is one of the largest impacts on this show, and production transport was the largest. To give some context, this was 40 shows across 81 days with around about 50k capacity per show. And there were 114 crew and 11 band members, including the supporting acts. 24 trucks, actually 12 on flip-flop, and 20 production trucks, and the artists were travelling by private jet, and there was a tour bus included as well. So there was no scrimping on this one, plenty of stuff in the mix. And what I wanted to do, if we can go to the next slide, is just show how this breaks down into the different scopes that Chiara so eloquently described earlier. So on scope 1 here, we've got the trucks, the production trucks, the artist private jet, and the tour bus. And that's because it's something that the tour production themselves are hiring. So they are in control of what they choose to hire, and therefore how much fuel is being used, of what type, etc. So that goes into scope 1. Scope 2 is the venue mains based upon the touring production's energy requirements. So that's why we're putting that into scope 2, because the tour production are paying for, or the artist is paying for that energy, electricity from the venue. And then in scope 3, we included the commercial flights of the crew, because the crew are traveling by commercial flight. That is not in control of the tour production. You can't tell, I'm sure it wasn't EasyJet they were traveling on, but you can't tell EasyJet what fuel they're going to use. No offense to EasyJet, of course. I just wouldn't travel with them. And then we included catering and hotels. We did not include the set build and embodied energy in that, and we did not include audience transport, but that could also be part of scope 3, because it's something that is, you have some influence, but you don't necessarily control it as the tour production. So next slide. So this is the mid-size tour. This one is 20 days and 5 shows across 5 cities with around about 5,500 capacity. It's 30 crew and 5 band members. And here is the staff and crew transport that is the lion's share of the impacts. Next slide. I feel like Carol Vorderman saying that for some reason. So scope 1 in this case is the 4 Arctics that were moving around the kit, and also the crew were a part of that. Runner vans as well are included in scope 1. Scope 2, again, the venue mains, the apportioned amount that is paid for the energy rider, essentially, for the energy required by the touring production. And then scope 3 is the commercial flights, the catering, and 661 hotel rooms. So next slide. This is the arena tour. So for this one, we've got 2 weeks, 10 shows in the UK with about 200 miles between each of them. About 12,000 capacity audience and 34 crew with 13 band members and personnel, including the support. So again, the production transport is one of the lion's share in this case. The accommodation is tiny, and that's because the crew were sleeping on the tour bus, essentially. So you can see how there isn't a one-size-fits-all in these scenarios. And going to the next slide to look at the scopes. here, scope 1 is much larger of a share because of the fact that everybody was in the buses, which were hired by the tour production. So they're in control of which types they purchase or which types they hire, and the ground transport. Scope 3 is quite small in this case. It's the catering and the hotels, but there's no commercial flights, for instance. And to just come back to the Live Green vision, we're talking about including scope 1, scope 2, and business transport, for example. And that's because as a touring production, as an example, anyone who's taking a commercial flight is scope 3. So if we exclude that, we're missing a big chunk of what we're actually in control of. So next slide. This one is a club academy tour. So this time the accommodation is a large amount, but you can look at the figures there. They're all 0 point something. So it's a much smaller impact, obviously, as you'd expect than the others. It's a 2-week tour with 10 shows, around about 350 capacity, 120 miles between shows, and 4 band members. The whole thing's done in a splitter van. So having a look at the scopes to give you an idea of where you place things. So there's really very little actually happening in scope 1 and 2 here, and the majority of the missions are falling into scope 3, which is going to be the catering, the hotels, and because they don't own the vehicles that they're using, that is also falling into scope 3. So something that I wanted to mention on this is with the venue's mains power that we've included, it was highly overspec'd, and this is something that tours in particular can really do some great work on, which also means that you're saving money, not spending it in order to improve your green credentials, because what we've been including here is a whole bunch of amps that are provided to the venue saying how much power is needed. We need to break that down into kilowatts, or better still kilowatt hours that we're estimating the usage of, so that we can start to use and spec correct amounts of energy, and then hopefully get lower bills as well from the venues for the power usage. Also one on food, just to add in, for tours, you can start to put meat and dairy as the special meal request instead of vegetarian or plant-based being the special meal request. So make plant-based normal, and if you really need, for special health reasons, to have meat and dairy, then that is the special request, and that will very quickly start to switch how much we're actually consuming. And seeing as we struggle with our transport emissions, we can at least easily, with no cost, change our food habits. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Jamal and the next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Thanks everybody who's thus far. I just really wanted to dive in on the Green Rider, which was first presented to me by Claire O'Neill at the AGF, which was pulled together by Paradigm and the AGF. It's a really, really simple fit and a wonderful checklist to go through, and it really just opens everybody's mind to what they can be doing on tour. It's really, really easy to transpose straight from the one sheet or the long version into your rider, and it starts just to get you cued into thinking and changing your thought process and how you're looking at tours. So I would recommend everybody to look at the Green Rider. It's very, very simple, and I'm sure, Claire, you can share that with everybody in the chat. So that's my overall the ride. And again, you have to clear that with management, I guess. But again, all the artists I've spoken to and I've got to take it on board have jumped on it. It's really, really straightforward. I've had no pushback on that at all. So I would thoroughly recommend everybody look at that. Again, the other thing I'd like to really just reiterate is time. I know Carol touched on this, but time really is of the essence, both in logistics and the planning and the construction of the tour. So time is absolutely of the essence on there. And over and above on that, there's a lot of chat going on, a lot of questions in the chat, one of which I'd really like to talk about streamlining. I know people are concerned about costs, the cost of the tour and sustainability. They go hand in hand. I mean, if you are reducing your power intake, you are reducing your cost, you are reducing the size of your tour and the type of your set pieces and the amount of trucks you use and the amount of buses, then you are going to be more economical. And I think that's very much the way they're looking at this. A sustainable business is good business practice. So it's very much of us getting out of the old ways, really looking at the way we run business to make this more streamlined. Also, I think the other thing is we really have to push forward on the venues and local government. it's really, really important that venues get online with this and start using more greener processes. And I know Live are going to be making a declaration about that as well. So I will wait for that news to come up later. And without further ado, I'm going to hand back to Chiara.
Thank you both so much for sharing that. So just to wrap up as we go to questions, as Jamal said, there's a few more of these coming up. So this Thursday at 11 a.m, we're doing a workshop on festivals. At 11 on the 29th of June, we're doing one for venues. And on the 30th of June at 11:30, we're doing one for artists and management. So please do join us for those if you want to dig deeper into some of those. But for now, we've got a few minutes left for questions. So please use the comments box to submit some questions. While you're getting your head into that, I'm going to pick up on some of the conversation that has come through already. I think one good comment by Paul around viability of touring by train. I think at the moment with the touring business models that we have, touring by train is not going to be possible for everyone. But what we have seen more recently is some commitments from some artists like Massive Attack to shift to train touring. On the classical music side as well, the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment have declared that they're not going to do any more European engagements if they can't travel by train. And so in those cases, it's artists that have come forward and they have made a statement and they have gone, actually, in good conscience, I no longer want to tour in a different way. So I'm going to make this train travel thing work for me, or at least see what it would take to get it to work for me. And I think there is an opportunity there as well for the Live Green Group and the music industry generally, when there are things like that that aren't working for us, to step forward and go lobby as one to say the train operators and go, you know what, if you had a safe lockup on certain services that we could book for instruments and production, then actually that would enable some of us to do more touring by train. But for that to work, I think it will take a lot more voices from the industry to come together and actually go and lobby. Some related questions around venue availability and routing, and that making it difficult to route smartly. Totally get it. It's at the moment one of the business model trickinesses, particularly also challenging the idea of exclusion zones that can make it very difficult to route in a good way. There are, again, some networks and others that have started trying to tackle that. For example, I know there's one in a jazz network in Nordic countries where a bunch of promoters and venues have kind of come together to almost offer packages or work very closely together, so that if artists are flying into Denmark or Norway or something else, they actually have a whole bunch of gigs lined up from that one flight that are all connected. So it's promoters kind of coming together as new networks. Some questions again around the artists and where some of these costs will be absorbed. I mean, I liked what Jamal and Claire said around, if we do this smartly and intelligently, it can also save us money. The other way to also look at it in some ways is that at some point this has to become the cost of doing business as well. So we are in the context of this climate emergency. There is more and more legislation that is building up around this. And as an industry, we can get ready to meet that. We can respond to that. We can lead on it from an ethical point of view, or we can be the laggards who will not do the right thing until we're being, made to with sticks and stones. So I think there's some weighing up here to do around if we think that music is a power for good in the world, then what does that actually mean in terms of our practices? And that does come through to a couple of the last few comments on Paul's side around, looking after people on tour. So not making people sleep in a tour bus because it's more environmentally preferable. Absolutely, we need to weigh up the rights of people on tour. But within that, if you know that accommodation is going to be a big part of your impact, then suddenly a focus could become choosing hotels that are powered by renewable electricity and that have really strong commitments around environment and sustainability. Again, some of it might mean looking at shifting some of our business models so that we're not putting so much strain on crews and artists, so that we have to come up with some of these solutions in the first place. Clara, it looked like you wanted to come in on the cost piece as well.
It's not like me to have something to say, is it? Yeah, so I mean, just to really echo everything that you've just been saying, and especially on the business models front, because as a touring industry, we've seen that when there is a crisis or a need by the governments globally, they will not think twice about shutting our industry down. And the laws are changing, and climate change is becoming more and more critical on an existential threat level. And if we don't change our business models and deal with these very valid and important and real points that you've raised, Paul, and that are echoed by many in the industry, if we don't deal with that, then we'll simply be shut down. And then the accountants are not going to be happy that we're not on the road, for one thing. Jamal?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this isn't just, our problem to solve. It's not, Paul, it's not your problem to solve. It's not one band's problem to solve. This is everybody's problem to solve. This is, it's the artists, it's the managers, it's the agents, it's the promoters, it's the production, it's the vendors, it's all your suppliers, it's local government, it's the transport. It's right across the board. Everybody needs to get the message here and fully understand everybody's worried about their back pocket. Well, especially coming out of a pandemic. But these conversations have to go across the board, and there has to be systemic change. And so this is part of the process. So, and as far as just the train travel, it's so much nicer to travel by train. I've done it, and it's so much easier. You cut out so much time by actually doing it. Interestingly enough, France have now declared any flight that you can get to nationally, that you can get to by train, is now being taken off schedule. So you have to take a train instead of flying there if it's easily done. And it does. It's so much time. There's no check-in. There's no security. There's none of that. There's no delays. No 20 minutes on the target. But I know we're running out of time, and so I'll pass it over to somebody else.
Carol, do you want to come in on that?
I just think we all should acknowledge the fact as well that the government is actually bringing in legislation that means that companies that have more than 250 employees or have more than a turnover higher than 36 million or 18 million on their balance sheets are now required to report their carbon emissions on scope 1 and 2 every year with their annual accounts. Now, it's blatantly obvious that once they've got these larger companies on board, they're going to start pushing down till they have all companies reporting on their carbon emissions on scope 1 and scope 2. And the other thing that the government are also bringing in is any procurement that is done for a government project over £5 million, now you will have to submit what your carbon reduction strategy is, even to tender for that work. So this is legislation that the government is bringing in, and we can expect it to filter down and reach all business everywhere in the country. So anybody that's not taking on board, collating the information to report on their emissions and developing a carbon reduction strategy is going to get hit by it eventually. So the best thing to do is to get everybody on board and working towards it now, and get everybody working on that train of thought, and that will be the way forward. And I completely agree with Claire. If we don't do what's required of us to do, we are going to get shut down. So we may as well get on board with it now.
Claire?
One other thought on the well-being and an exercise that we do when we're consulting with different organisations is to look at the budget and try and map onto it how much of your budget is being spent on fossil fuel and how much of your budget is being spent on creativity or people development. Because, for example, taking more crew days in order to either train local people on the road to do certain jobs, or to take longer over travel to reduce the emissions, or to change perhaps something in the design, which means less trucks but more people days, then ultimately we as an industry aren't turning successful artists' careers essentially into environmental degradation and spending all of our money, our hard-earned time that's being turned into this fantastic energy of money into fossil fuels, which is essentially what we're largely doing now. So if you can break down the budget in that way and just try to reapply it, it doesn't necessarily cost more.
Definitely, it's something we do a lot as well, which is looking at budgets as a whole. So if it costs you more in people time, but you've made a saving in material or other time, then actually we should count that as a net win for the industry in terms of the people who work in it. So we're coming to the end. I do just want to give a shout to one of the other conversations happening in the chat from Judy, who wants to put forward initiatives that are regenerative on tour. For example, community-based projects that could be suggested for days off activities, local food banks to minimize food waste, and asking about other suggestions for giving back when in a city, or information on organizations that have info on these initiatives. I think there's so much more room to do so much more of this. There's a brilliant initiative actually in the Netherlands called 10,000 Hours, which grew out of the festival sector there, which organizes volunteer days for festival ticket holders to go off and do tree planting or help out in local schools or other things. So kind of giving back to the communities that host those festivals and events. Similar things around doing, say, beach cleanups, particularly if you're working with an artist who has a big connection to ocean conservation. And kind of, I think that's it. It's having a conversation about what are the things that matter most to you, and therefore what can you focus on in the cities and places that you play. So with that, we've come to time. Thank you so much to Jamal, Claire and Carol for sharing. Thanks also to everyone who's been tuning in and so generously sharing your thoughts and questions in the chat. And of course, a massive thank you to Live, who are hosting these workshops and sort of pushing forward on this vision to get us all in a room together and asking the tricky questions and trying to come up with new ways of looking at things. So with that, thank you so much, and we'll leave it there.